Hi, I'm James Page. I'm a product manager at Speechmatics, and welcome to today's webinar on the state of voice technology in the media and broadcast industry. So we just got back from IBC in September. We had a great show. There was lots of interest in the product, and I think a real sense of progress over the last 12 months, both in terms of our own product offering and also in terms of what people are using ASR technology for. And the maturity of their products out there. So what are we going to be talking about today? First off, I want to highlight where we are in general with speech technology in media and broadcast, and also how Speechmatics in particular is helping to enable this shift in how voice is being used in the industry. Then what I'll do is I'll focus on some future directions where I can see ourselves extending our speech offerings, and more generally in terms of where speech technology is going in terms of media offerings. I would point out that we've recently published an industry report on the state of voice in the media and broadcast industry. You can download it from our website, and I'd highly recommend doing that and looking through it. As part of that report, we also undertook a survey, which many of you may have participated in. So during this webinar, we'll be highlighting some of those findings and pulling out some of the interesting stats that we've got from that survey. The other thing we'll be doing today is we're running a couple of polls through the webinar. So it would be really great to hear your views on the industry and how speech is enabling your work. So that would be good to get your views on those subjects. And finally, if you do have any questions on what's being covered today during the webinar, then please let us know. We'll do our best to answer them at the end. And if you do have general questions about Speechmatics technology or other feedback, then please respond to hello@speechmatics.com. We'll be really happy to hear from you. So without further ado, we'll let you take a look at the first poll, which should be coming up now. So this one is a very quick one. Are you currently using speech technology within your business? So just take a few seconds for you to answer that if you can. Okay, so it seems like about 3/4 of you are currently using ASR, and the rest are in the process of evaluating or not currently using it. Okay, that's interesting. Right, so if we go back to the deck, I want to pull out some of the factors that are motivating people to adopt a voice strategy in the media industry. So what are the factors pushing media companies to adopt ASR? Well, I think the main one is clearly the ability to quickly transcribe human speech and to make it easy to caption or edit video, making their media more searchable. So automatic speech recognition, or ASR, is now a relatively mature technology. So costs are coming down and performance is still going up. So it's now quicker to transcribe, but also more accurate than it's ever been. And this allows people to be more productive. So you can see the wood for the trees in your content. You can focus more on the end goals and use your expertise rather than having to manually transcribe content, which is really a drudge piece of work. So I think the main thing that we see is that people are really finding a lot of productivity gains when they adopt ASR technology. That's not to say that there aren't pain points and challenges to using the technology. So for some use cases, fully automatic ASR is not yet accurate enough. So for things like live news broadcasts or kind of highly risky, I guess, content where you absolutely cannot get any errors in the transcription, for those cases, a fully automatic solution is probably not the answer yet. But even within those use cases, there is still benefit from using ASR. So it improves the ability of human transcribers to quickly and accurately do their work. And also it just brings down the time it takes to do transcriptions and make captions available, which is obviously that's a key point for highly time-sensitive use cases like live news, for example. Also, it's fairly complex at the moment, I would say, to deploy speech technology. You kind of have to know your way around how to use speech technology APIs. There has to be, I guess, some level of technical knowledge to be able to get these technologies to do what you want. So we're working to make it less complex and easier to deploy, but I think there's a general agreement that there's still a ways to go to make it easy enough for media companies to use. Finally, it's fairly costly still at the moment. So although the prices of transcription services are coming down, there may be some contents where it's not really, there's no real business case yet to fully transcribe these pieces of content. But over time, that's going to become less and less an issue. Finally, there's data privacy issues, which are really becoming more, I guess, more prevalent now that people are aware of their own data, where it goes, and that's causing some people to think where they want to host their ASR technology, for example. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on in the webinar. Before we get on to that, though, we have another poll coming up. So if you'd just like to spend some time to answer that. Quick question, really. If you're using speech technology, and sounds like many of you are, is it currently accurate enough for your own use cases? So that would be interesting to see whether you have an opinion on that. Okay, yes, so yeah, over half of you do not have accurate enough transcriptions yet for your use case. Okay. Yeah, to be honest, I guess that's not completely surprising to me. Okay, well, we'll bearing that in mind, we'll go on and we'll see if there's things that we can do in the product to make it more usable for you and pull out some things which I hope will interest you for future use of the technology. So we talked briefly about benefits. I just want to pull out some interesting figures we got from the survey that we did. So this information is all available in the report that you can download. I've just pulled out a slide here where we've asked people what are the benefits to you of using voice technology. And possibly not surprisingly, most people find the operational efficiencies to be the main benefit to them. So basically reducing the time it takes to turn around content workflows, boost productivity and lowering costs, obviously. Also, interestingly, not far behind, we have people who are using ASR to build in a competitive advantage. So that's leveraging some of the capabilities that ASR provides and basically driving up the value of their content. So maybe using the content in ways that they hadn't previously thought of, expanding it to new audiences, and so on. So really helping people to find value in the content that they didn't know existed before. An example there might be making their content more searchable, so having a transcript to allow that content to be searched electronically, or even providing a more accessible experience for customers. So people, for example, with hearing impairments would benefit from captions, obviously. And also generally, I think not just for that audience, but more widely, people are wanting to have video content that is captioned. So people who are on the go, maybe looking at content on their mobile phones, they often have the volume switched down. They're on a train or a bus and they still want to access the content, but they just don't want to do it with the sound turned up. So it's basically making that content more available, and ASR is a key component of being able to do that. It was interesting for us when we looked at what media companies are expecting from a speech technology provider, what people said. Possibly no surprise is that number one is a basic word accuracy. So it's a given really that an ASR system is accurate and produces the right words. Common sense, you might say. But beyond that, there is some interesting things that we found out. So the ability to provide word timings is very interesting for people. They want to align what was said with keyframes in the video. So you need accurate word timings to do that. The ability to have confidence scores. So that's something where you may have a number of different outputs from the speech engine, and you don't necessarily want to just look at the best, the most confident output. You may want to look at other variants. And even if you do just want to look at the most likely outcome, you may want to know whether the speech engine was confident or not about the output. Things like editing applications, you may want to indicate to a human transcriber if a particular transcript is likely or not likely and help them make edits, for example. So that's interesting. Also, something that we've seen recently over the last year really is more and more people being interested in showing non-speech events like a speaker change, for example. So identifying in a dialogue, for example, when one speaker takes over and then marking that in the transcript somehow. That's now possible through a speaker change feature that we have, and we're looking at improving that over time. And finally, just something we found at the IBC event, where we were showing advanced punctuation for the first time. Around 64% of respondents in the survey said that they expected punctuation to be available. And what we do now is we provide, for the most common languages anyway, an advanced punctuation feature where we're able to show commas, exclamation marks, question marks, in addition to full stops, which is like the basic level of punctuation. So we found in the survey another interesting stat here: 73% of media companies who are using punctuation are now using it as a key way of benchmarking the different providers. So it's really key for us to have that feature to make sure we're competitive in the market. And we'll go through in a bit more detail later on what that means. Okay, so that was an interesting slide with some useful data from the survey that we picked out. What I want to do now is concentrate more on the main pillars that you should be looking at when you're choosing an ASR provider. We just outlined them here on this slide at the top there. What do we mean by these aspects, and how would you go about rating a provider based on those? So let's go into a bit more detail about accuracy, which is really the main one that you're looking at when you're comparing speech providers. What does it mean when we say accuracy? Well, there's different measures of rating accuracy. You can use an objective score like the word error rate, which is really the standard way still of evaluating speech to text systems. You can use a subjective measure like the style of punctuation, and that will probably depend on the type of content you're transcribing and your own house rules in terms of how much punctuation you like in your transcripts and what type of punctuation. Things like formatting of entities. So these are things like numbers and dates. So is it easy, for example, to identify when a number appears in the transcript, and can you reformat that to your own liking? And then there are things like non-speech events. So these are things like hesitations in speech, music, laughter, applause, and so on. So are these things that are of interest to you that you want in the transcript, or maybe they're things that you don't want? These are all things that you need to look at when you're choosing a provider. And obviously they differ in different domains. So some people want a very accurate transcript which includes those non-speech events. Other people just want them to be filtered out or not appear at all. So accuracy is I guess, a many-faceted thing that you need to really consider in all its different implications there, not just the plain word error rate. So performance is the second pillar really that I guess you need to look at. And when we talk about performance, we're really talking about how quickly you can turn around a transcript. So obviously there's two different modes that we talk about when we talk about transcription. So there's real-time transcription, like a live news broadcast where you want the transcript to appear as quickly as possible after the word was spoken. And then we're really talking about a latency, which you want to be as low as possible. So once the word is spoken, you really want it to be returned as a piece of text within a couple of seconds, I would say. Now, obviously, that's a challenge because the shorter the utterance, the less context you have to make that accurate. So what we found is that typically with our systems, if you bring that latency below about 2 seconds, accuracy degrades quite quickly. And obviously, if you're prepared to accept a lower latency, so allow a longer time for the transcript to appear, then you can get some benefit in terms of accuracy. So it's really a trade-off there. I need to think about that. And then for like a batch transcript model where you're processing a large volume of audio files, you're really interested then in the volume of audio that you can process within a given time. And you're looking to do that in a greater than real-time manner. So basically you can, with an ASR system, you can process audio faster than it's being spoken, basically. And you want to get that time down as much as you can. And obviously there's an impact there in terms of processing time and therefore the expense of processing a piece of audio. So that's what you really want to consider when you're looking at performance. Similarly with ease of use, the system needs to be easy to deploy and given your own requirements. So is it a cloud solution that you're looking for? Is it on-prem? You need to make sure that you can use common APIs like REST APIs, WebSocket APIs, and to access the service wherever it is, whether it's on a private cloud, a public cloud, or on-premise. And you need to make sure that wherever you do deploy it, it's easy to set up and secure, obviously. So some interesting things here from the survey again. We found that generally people were prepared to connect to the internet, so they were happy with a cloud provision. In general, though, there are some people still who need a on-premise solution, either for privacy concerns, or sometimes it's just because of the sheer volumes of content that they want to process. It's just not economical to do that by copying that up to the cloud. So yeah, some interesting stats there, I think. So we talked finally about price in the survey, and obviously pricing needs to be transparent. So it needs to be clear what it is you're paying for. For example, some providers may charge extra for storage. For some, it may be bundled as part of the overall cost. I won't really spend too much time talking about price, but obviously it's a major concern as well. It needs to be considered in a way that's comparing apples with apples as much as possible. Okay, so those are the main things. We also looked at some other considerations that are important for people. So we mentioned data privacy earlier. So 80% of respondents in the survey said it was important that they had data privacy. Obviously, if it's your own content, if it's copyrighted content, you don't want that to leak out. You need to make sure it's secure, stored securely, and retention policies and so on are match what you want. The number of languages that are supported is also becoming more important, I think, as content is not the amount of content growing in each language. The ability to efficiently process documents and content, not just in English, is becoming more important. And we saw that a lot at IBC. It's a very international show. and we got lots of people interested in all sorts of languages that most of which we support, a few of which we don't, but we're looking at adding those to the catalogue of commercial languages we have. And finally, ease of integration. We mentioned that before. The time it takes to get your solution to market, obviously that's key in terms of your own competitive advantage. We want to make sure that it's as easy as possible to run evaluations and then make an integration to allow you to deliver that service to your customers. Okay, so we're going to take some time out now to run the third of our polls. So this one is really around how you go about testing speech technology providers. So if you're currently using a provider or are about to use one, how do you go about evaluating it? Do you have your own test framework, for example? Okay, that's interesting. So sounds like the majority of people have their own framework that they use. I guess it's not something we don't necessarily know when people are using their own framework, but it's good to know that you're actually using some tools that allow you to do some sort of repeatable test. So obviously something that's we haven't really talked about here, but you know, it is a competitive market, and providers are changing and updating and modifying their language models all the time. So it's certainly not a market where you can stay still, and we're constantly looking to benchmark ourselves against our competitors and add new features and functionality to the product to make it compelling for media providers. Okay, so we had that little poll there about testing, and I guess if we were to ask about how you go about testing, probably most people would say that you're looking to make sure that the correct words are output, and I think that's kind of a given in terms of how you'd evaluate an ASR system. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but it's available in the report there, so you can have a look at it. But we will just dive into a bit more detail about these metrics, what they mean, and how you would go about measuring them. So, correct word accuracy, what does it mean, and how would you measure it? Well, the standard measure is the word error rate, WER, and there are tools out there that will allow you to pretty easily measure that. So basically you have a base transcript, like a golden transcript, which you know is correct, and then you would measure your speech transcript outputs against that, looking for insertions, deletions, and substitutions. It's a very easy percentage score that you can get. Obviously, the lower the error rate is, the better. And what we're seeing on a lot of broadcast data sets is you can get accuracy rates, word error rates, that is, of 5% or less even. So in other words, around 95% of words are correct. I won't really talk about that in too much detail because it's quite an easy score to understand, and certainly if you need help in terms of measuring it, we've got recommendations of tools and frameworks that you could use to do so. Moving on to punctuation though, standard scores for this don't really exist. I mean, people have used F-scores or slot error rates or other similar scores to measure punctuation. But I think it's true to say that measuring punctuation isn't as commonly done, partly because it's not so easy to generate a reference sentence, a reference transcript for punctuation. So punctuation is highly subjective for, especially for things like spontaneous speech. For example, how many commas, where do you put commas in? These are questions that people often can't agree on. So punctuation, often we find people when they're looking at punctuation, they may just be eyeballing it to make sure it looks good and basically aligns with their own house styles for how they want to punctuate. Worth pointing out at this point that the advanced punctuation feature that we've added, it does allow you some measure of control over how you punctuate. So you can choose what punctuation marks you put in a transcript, and you can also dial up and down the sensitivity which dictates how many punctuation marks will go into the transcript. So that's definitely something that's we need to put more effort into, I think, in terms of how we allow people to measure punctuation. And I think it's going to become more important over time. Turnaround time. So this is the performance metric we mentioned previously. Performance is a key driver for comparing speech providers. So what is turnaround time? Well, we have this measure which we call real-time factor, or RTF, which is used to express the turnaround time in terms of the length of the audio. So we normally want our RTF score to be around 0.5 or less, which means that the transcript should take at least half the time of the audio. So if you have a 10-minute audio file, we would normally expect the transcript to become available within 5 minutes of submitting that job. That's for the batch case. Obviously, for real time, you're looking at a real time factor of around 1. It shouldn't be much more than 1. And you want to make sure that over time, for the real time case, that you don't start to see a lag in the real time factor. You want to make sure that the speech engine is always able to keep up with the stream as it's coming in. So turnaround time is fairly easy to measure. It's basically something you can build into your own test framework yourself. It's not really too difficult. The concepts are fairly easy to understand there. It's a bit more difficult with things like speaker change and repeat speaker accuracy. So this is where you're looking to see that a speaker change label has been injected into the transcript at the correct time. And obviously you want to make sure that they align correctly with when a speaker comes in. Again, you need some sort of reference transcript to be able to do this test objectively. And we've seen people using F-scores as a way of seeing whether there's like too many false positives or false negatives for this. So it's something that is possible to do yourself if you want to. Again, some people may just be content to rely on eyeballing the output and making sure it looks good for their transcript use case. Okay, so these are all general principles, I guess, and things to look at when choosing any speech technology provider. What about the things that Speechmatics is doing? So what are the things that we're looking at putting into the product in the next 12 months to basically help with improving accuracy or the way that speaker change and punctuation is handled? Well, I want to show first off a demo that we took to IBC this year, which is using facial recognition. So what we did here is we used video recognition machine learning algorithms to basically train on a publicly available database of human faces, and then for novel faces in a video stream, identify and label those faces. So you can see there's a bounding box around each face that has an identity number. And when you go out of shot and back in, it remembers the ID or the label of that face. This is something that we're looking at as a way of potentially improving the way we do speaker diarization and basically keeping a track of who in the video is speaking. So if we know at which keyframe or time offset a new speaker comes in, we can then use that as a cue to help us get better accuracy for our speaker change algorithm. So that's something, a good example of using the video output to help improve accuracy for the speech component. Another one that we also took to IBC as a part of our products lab was around using optical character recognition, or OCR, to pull text from, in this case, a football team roster, and use that as a way of bootstrapping our custom dictionary feature. So custom dictionary is a way of adding like odd or strange foreign words into a language model and then getting better accuracy for those. So this one pulls pulls some text off of the screen from a screen roster, and then uses that to inject into custom dictionary. So the top caption here is without that additional word information added into the custom dictionary. You can see there's many errors there because it's a English language model. It doesn't know about German surnames, for example, so it gets a lot of them wrong. Whereas the bottom transcript has taken in that OCR input. It's used the custom dictionary to add those words into the dictionary, and then it's got much better recognition on those foreign words. So again, that's similar to the last example. That's a way of using information in the video stream for a media application to improve the accuracy of the ASR component. The last thing that I want to talk about around like new features that we're looking at adding into the product is around richer output formats. So something we already find people using the technology for is around media monitoring. So pulling out from maybe a live stream or an archive of content, keywords that you want to use for monitoring purposes. We're looking at extending our existing APIs to make it easier to do this. So something that is not possible to do at the moment is pull out lower confidence words that maybe contain interesting information about brands or people, but they're not the best fit. So they're not the most confident word that we would normally output in a transcript, but it still may be useful to find those in your speech transcript. So we're looking at including that information in a media monitoring keyword spotting API to make that type of thing easier to do. Similarly with metadata for asset management, something that people use our technology for at the moment. What we want to do is make it easier to pull out metadata from an asset. So we're looking at adding an API to allow topics to be generated from the transcript, and that would make it easier to catalog content, make it more searchable, and so on. So those are a few things that we're looking at doing. They're not in the product at the moment, but they're certainly things that we're actively working on, and we're hoping will appear in the product in the next 12 months or so. Okay, and finally, just before we wrap up the webinar, just some predictions for futures. So what we think is going to happen in the industry and where voice is going generally. So I think it's clear that voice is becoming a more accepted way generally of interacting with content, with media content, and people's familiarity with things like voice assistants is really raising the profile of ASR technology, and meaning that people are much more aware of what it can be used for and more confident, I suppose, in using it. So yeah, to a large extent, people's confidence with the technology and comfort with using it has improved, and it's now becoming commonplace really to see ASR being used in media applications. I guess parallel with that, you've got increased volumes of media, which means that traditional human-based methods of tracking and auditing content are no longer really able to scale. So as I mentioned at the beginning, for high-value, high-risk content, such as live news, there's probably still a need for a human to validate an ASR transcript. But even with that use case, speech technology is really an enabler to make the job of those human transcribers easier, more productive, more enjoyable. In the areas of metadata creation and keyword spotting, as we mentioned, the ability to quickly traverse large data files and pick out relevant terms without having a human agency, that's really incredibly powerful. And it allows your digital asset libraries to be more fully monetized. I think that's a really interesting phenomenon that we're going to see more and more of coming years. Finally, voice control of the TV experience. So having command and control, ability to search for consumers to search content themselves through their voice. That's not something that we're currently offering through the product, but it's certainly something we're looking at doing in coming months to offer a voice control component that would allow command and control type applications to be used within media. So that's really all I wanted to say. I think during the webinar, I've come to the end of my part. I would again recommend that you go to the website and download the report if you haven't already done so, and look at that. But I think we have some time now at the end just to answer a few questions. So if you have any questions that you'd like answered, or things that I didn't cover in the talk that you want me to, then now's the time to raise them, and we'll try and work through as many as we can. Okay, so we have one already, which is around, have you considered using acoustic elements in speech that aren't related to words? Okay, so I guess when it comes to non-speech elements in the stream, we mentioned previously that we need to consider things like hesitations, music, applause, and so on. So those are things that we currently don't necessarily output in the speech stream, but we are looking at basically making those into entities that you can then decide to filter or take some action with. So that's something that we're looking at doing. I guess the other thing is really around speaker change. So it's a feature that we have introduced this year, using the fundamental frequency of a voice or other voice characteristics to see when a speaker has changed, and then outputting a token when that happens. We're actively working on improvements to that to make it more accurate. So expect some updates on the speaker change feature in the not too distant future. Okay, another one is, okay, this is something we get asked quite a lot, especially at places like IBC. So how much data is required to build a decent language model? Okay, often people say, you know, we've got an application in a particular language, maybe we don't offer that language at the moment. You know, how much data would we need? And also, if we were to get that data, what's involved in preparing it for training? So in general, possibly not surprisingly, the more data you use to train a model, generally the better the accuracy. We'd normally expect to have about 150 hours minimum of audio data to build a decent acoustic model. And that's audio data with correct transcripts, obviously, so we can align those. We also use text data that can be used to build the language model, and generally we just use as much as we can find. That's a lot easier to locate. But just as an example, we've recently retrained our Dutch model in the last couple of months, and we added about 1,000 hours, of audio training data, and we did that across multiple spoken sources, so not just media use cases, but also telephony use cases as well. And for that, we saw a fairly dramatic improvement, so around a 5% word error rate improvement, which is fairly significant. Okay, so other questions that we've got coming up. Okay, numbers are currently very difficult due to formatting. What are we doing in terms of improving number recognition accuracy? So we understand that people have their own ways of formatting and representing numbers. So a couple of things we're doing in the short term will basically improve the consistency with which we output numbers. So we're looking at basically outputting any number below 10 as a word and doing that consistently. And then for numbers over 10, we're then looking at having a canonical way of representing that number in the transcript. And then it's up to the person consuming that transcript. If they want to reformat that, they can, but obviously they have to know that it's going to be output consistently in the ASR transcript to be able to do that. So the first thing we're looking at doing is making sure that our numbers are much more consistent in the way that they're represented in the transcript. Another question here, how far is multilingual VR developed in Speechmatics? So I guess VR is related to virtual reality. I'm not sure we have any applications for people using that at the moment. but certainly, yeah, I don't see that's necessarily any different from the way we would use our ASR with any other technology. So if it's a language that's supported in our set, then we would look at it. Okay, if it's to do with multi-language voice recognition, okay, so now I understand. Okay, so this is where you've got a piece of content in multiple different languages. So that's actually quite a challenging problem in speech recognition to do. One of the things we are looking at doing in the fairly short term is having a decent language identification algorithm that we can use. So being able to automatically decide which language model to use for a given transcript. I guess as a follow-on from that, then we can start looking at, okay, if you've got a piece of content with multiple different languages, being able to provide an accurate transcript using whichever language model is most appropriate. So I would say it's probably fairly far off to have that, but as an initial step, we're certainly looking at improving the ability of the ASR system to recognize a particular language. Fairly easy one here is how many languages do we have at the moment? So we currently support 29 commercial languages. We're looking at offering more, obviously, and I would say in general we typically add like 3 or 4 languages a year to that list of languages. Very much depends on the amount of data that we can get for those, and obviously also the commercial value of having those. So we need to make sure if we're going to go ahead and build a language, that there's actually going to be demand, sufficient demand to make us want to do that. So obviously, if you have any particular language requests, then we're always really interested to hear them, and then we can start talking about what's involved in making a language we don't have available. Someone's asked about language independent ASR. So I guess that relates to the one about multilingual voice recognition. At the moment, we have, as I said, 29 languages. We've actually, in a way, constrained the number of languages that we used to have because we no longer have different variants of English. So we used to have a US, an American, and an Australian variant of English. We now have a generic English model, and that's a lot easier for people to deal with. So we mentioned about multilingual there. Often we find, like with English, you may get several variants of English being spoken within the same piece of content, different accents and so on. So the ability to use a single model for that is very useful. I guess taking that to the next step, if you have multiple languages in a particular piece of content, being able to use a single model for that. To be honest, I think that's probably quite a long way away. There's some exciting developments in terms of using neural networks, machine learning techniques, but I think to have a fully independent language model is probably some time away. I think finally, a couple more questions. So we got one about, do we have Norwegian and Arabic models? Yes, we do. So those are new languages that we launched this year, along with Mandarin. If you go to speechmatics.com, you can get a full list of the languages that we currently support, those 29, and obviously we'll update that and we'll let you know with press releases when new languages are added to that. So the report itself that I mentioned is available on the Speechmatics website. If you go to the banners in the media broadcast page of the website, then you can register and access the report from there. It'd be really interesting to get your feedback on whether you find that an interesting report for you, and hopefully it will generate some discussions amongst you. Finally, I think we've got time for one more question. So what successes, if any, have you had with real-time captioning of live TV programming? So probably, I guess, the most high-profile one that we've had is around a partnership with Redby. So when we were at IBC, they were using us to power their live captioning service. Now Redbee, they obviously they're doing things like live news captioning. They still rely on human transcribers, but they do use our technology to provide like a base level transcript, which can then be adapted by human very easily to provide near real-time live captions. And it was interesting, they were able to point to a very significant productivity gain for using the new punctuation that we have. So basically making it easier for those people who are doing the live transcribing to take a raw transcript from the ASR system and repurpose it so it's good enough for a live broadcast. Okay, we have another question here. So how do we deal with diacritics in Dialectal Arabic? So the variant of Arabic that we currently offer is a modern standard Arabic. It's used by people. We know we don't necessarily have any good feedback, I would say, at this moment about what people are using it for, how useful they find it. So what I would say is if you have been using Arabic and you've got feedback, good or bad, then we're always interested to hear. We're not currently looking at providing different variants of Arabic. So for medium broadcast, we've trained a model basically using a lot of medium broadcast data. Obviously, if there's significant interest in different variants of Arabic, then we would look at supporting those in the product. So again, if you've got specific questions about Arabic variants that you're interested in, interesting use cases, then we're always happy to hear about those. So have a question here about NER compliancy. So NER compliancy is a very stringent requirement for accuracy, and to be honest, it's something that a lot of ASR providers currently struggle with. I'm not aware of any speech to text systems that are currently fully NER compliant. I think that's a way off. So if you're really looking for high accuracy for things like news broadcasts, then I would say most broadcasters would probably be looking to use a system provided by, for example, the likes of Redbee, where they're able to maybe take an ASR transcript and then refine it with human beings to provide an almost 100% transcript. Okay, so finally, the last question I think we have is, similar question to others about language detection. So it was interesting, this was something we found a lot at the IBC, a lot of people asking about language detection. It is, in terms of what our machine learning group is looking at here, it's the next on the list to look at. So we've been looking at improving advanced punctuation, speaker change over the last 9 to 6 months. The next thing that they'll be looking at is around language detection, and using that to basically make media workflows more efficient, and basically you don't have to worry about determining what language your content is in. You can just submit it to the system and it will work out which language model to use. So yeah, that's something that is a lot of people have talked about. We know there's interest in it, and it's certainly something that we want to offer through the product, in the next 12 months or so. Okay, so we're now at the end of the webinar. We've prepared a short survey for you with 4 questions. It would be really interesting for us to hear if there's any content you'd like to see in future discussions. So this is the first webinar we've run around media and broadcast, but we want to make sure that there are others. and we're always keen to get views from the industry about what are the interesting topics, what are the things that people would like to see and talk about. So thank you very much for your time. I think we're going to wrap up now. And yeah, I would say please go and look at the report if you haven't already done so. And yes, we would love to hear your feedback on the webinar and the report in general. So thank you very much.